From the BBC World Service, in association with ABC and Akashvani, this is Stumped.
Hello, I'm Alison Mitchell and welcome to Stumped. With me for the ABC This Week in Adelaide is Aaron Bryans. Welcome to you. And Charu Sharma is with us for Akashvani in Bangalore. Now, the list of players for the 100 auction, the England and Wales franchise competition, has been confirmed. It features 16 players from Pakistan, 14 men and 2 women, including fast bowler Haris Rauf, who's one of 10 marquee players. Sadia Iqbal, the number 1 T20 international bowler in the world, features on the women's side, along with national captain Fatima Sana. Now, the ECB and the 800 teams recently issued a statement after BBC Sport reported that the 4 franchises with owners linked to the Indian Premier League wouldn't consider players from Pakistan. That statement said that all 8 teams commit to selection being based solely on cricketing performance, availability and the needs of each team. The ECB, it says, is committing to ensuring there is no place for discrimination and has regulations in place to take robust action to tackle any such conduct. Players must not be excluded on the grounds of their nationality. I've been speaking to Dr. Gregory Iyar-Andis, Professor of Sports Law at Sheffield Hallam University and practicing attorney at law with over 26 years of experience in representing clients at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, to find out how governing bodies can ensure players aren't discriminated against due to their nationality. And he began by explaining just what discrimination is.
Well, discrimination means treating someone less favorably than someone else because of age, disability, race, gender reassignment, and so on. And there are obviously different types of discrimination. And the present matter of the 100 auction event, we're looking at the possibility of race discrimination, as you said, because the allegation concerns a type of an alleged discrimination against nationality. This is one of the so-called protected characteristics. And it is important to state on this point that in the UK, the Equality Act 2010 legally protects people from discrimination in the workplace and, of course, in the wider society.
So the ECB put out this statement in conjunction with the 100 teams. How easy or otherwise is it for the governing body to, if you like, enforce that statement, to ensure that players aren't discriminated against at auction due to what country they come from?
Sport governing bodies need to ensure that there are clear policies against discrimination, and such policies are notified to all participants and, of course, to the organizers of an event or a competition. And such policies, this is important to say here, such policies do exist in the sport of cricket. However, the question is not whether such policies exist, but whether they can be enforced. And as a result, you may appreciate this is not a question of law, but rather a question of political decision-making.
What do you mean by that, political decision-making? I mean, how would discrimination be proven, if you like, if there was a genuine concern and an allegation?
Well, in this instance, the ECB, which is the governing body for cricket in England, may commence its own investigation after having received the relevant complaint, or they may refer the matter to the independent cricket regulator. Now, there has to be obviously clear evidence to support any allegations the ECB may receive, and in that instance, depending on what the results of the investigations are, they may decide to proceed with a hearing.
What is the probability of any hearing being successful? When you're talking about sport selection, it's an auction. There are a myriad of reasons why a player might be overlooked in an auction that don't have anything to do with their nationality. How could that ever be proven if that was the allegation?
I think you may be alluding to the fact that there are selection patterns here in relation to the organizer. Well, and if that's the case, you could create an argument here, but it would be very, very difficult to prove it in a court of law or in a disciplinary tribunal. This is because the organizer or the regulator is better suited to decide on matters of selection. And of course, as an organizer of an event, it can determine its own criteria, provided that such criteria do not violate the regulatory framework of the sport governing body. And of course, such criteria, they do not violate the law of the land. it is important to actually state here that the organizer can also cite logistical or contractual reasons in their defense, making the case more difficult to prove. And if you would allow me, I have to say that a tribunal or a court would never be involved in matters of pure sporting nature, including the process upon which players are selected to participate in an event. And on this point, it is worth mentioning that the Court for Arbitration for Sport in Lausanne, as well as other national sport tribunals, have repeatedly argued in the past that they can only exercise their supervisory control and ensure all processes have been followed. What they cannot do is interfere with the decision-making on pure sporting and technical matters.
So if any player suspected discrimination, who would be the party to instigate a complaint? Would it be on the player themselves? Would it be a governing body to intervene? I mean, who sits where in this circumstance of a franchise competition?
Well, this is a very good question. It affects obviously procedure. Primarily it would be the players, the affected players. Now, in the absence of a complaint from the affected players, the ECB, which is the regulator for cricket in England, has the power and the discretion, obviously, to initiate their own investigation and decide on sanctions, if the case is proven, that is. Or they may decide to refer the matter to the independent cricket regulator, and then the cricket regulator can actually do the same. They can commence an investigation. If they feel the allegations have been proven, then obviously they have the power to apply sanctions against the defendant.
Okay, so that comes back to the question of how difficult would discrimination based on nationality be in the case of sporting franchise competition and buying players at an auction?
In my professional opinion, it would be extremely difficult, because when you make a discrimination claim, you need to show the court evidence that you have been treated unfairly, and that the reason you have been treated unfairly is because of a protected characteristic, and nationality obviously is a protected characteristic. You also need to satisfy several different legal tests, and of course, you need to provide the court with clear evidence that you have been discriminated against. And as a complainant, you have the burden of proof. In other words, you need to prove to the court on the balance of probabilities, that it is more probable than not that discrimination has taken place against you. If you manage to do this, then the burden of proof shifts to the defendant, who will then have to rebut the allegations. There is also a technical matter here that it may arise or it may not. But if it were to arise before the cricket regulator, that means that an objection may be raised by the organizers in relation to the standard of proof. Now, in the sports law discipline, the established standard of proof is different, and it is higher than the civil standard of the balance of probabilities. In sports law, we use a higher standard of proof, and the party alleging a fact must prove it to the so-called comfortable satisfaction of the tribunal. Now, for your audience to understand this, we must state that the more serious the allegation, the higher the degree of evidence required to prove such allegation, and therefore you may appreciate that if the organizers were to object and ask the regulator to use the sports law standard of proof as opposed to the civil standard of proof, this would make the case of discrimination even more difficult to prove.
And it sounds quite costly for a player to undergo such a process.
It is quite costly, yes, because you have to instruct expert lawyers, you have to actually gather all the appropriate evidence, and you need to have available resources to you to actually ensure that you are able to prove the case. And of course, if you fail in terms of proving the case, then you have legal costs, you have court costs. It's just extremely expensive.
Is there any precedent for a player of a team sport around the world to have challenged or made such an allegation of discrimination based on nationality when it comes to selection or purchase at auction?
There are several cases from different sports. Theoretically, it may be used in future disputes in the UK or even elsewhere. However, it is important to know that each case is decided upon according to its individual characteristics, and therefore any comparisons between such cases must be treated with caution.
Okay, so if a case was brought forward, if there was a player who felt they had been discriminated against, and if it was successful, a lot of ifs there, could a successful case in the UK set a precedent for other cases at other franchise leagues in different parts of the world?
Yeah, it is possible that can actually happen. It may be obviously used here in the UK in future disputes. It could be used elsewhere around the world. But as I explained, it is important to obviously note that its case is decided upon according to its individual characteristics. So if you were actually going to draw any comparisons here, such comparisons may be treated with caution.
And ultimately, that comes back to how something is proven. And when you are selecting or buying a player at auction, just that challenge of asserting that the reason why you have been left out is because of your nationality, that would still remain extremely difficult from what you are saying.
I couldn't agree more, because it is going to be extremely difficult to prove it, even with a lower standard to prove, which is on the balance of probabilities, which is the standard, the civil standard to prove. You have to actually produce clear evidence that cannot be rebutted, evidence that demonstrates that these players have been discriminated against because of their nationality. It is extremely difficult to prove such thing.
Dr. Gregory Ioannidis, thank you very much for being on Stumped.
Thank you.
Well, that was Dr. Gregory Ioannidis on the challenges of ensuring players aren't discriminated against when it comes to auction. Now, Charu, how did that BBC story go down in India? The allegation that it was indicated teams with Indian ownership in the 100 weren't considering signing players from Pakistan.
To the best of my knowledge, it was ignored. Now, let's also remember that there is no fact here. There's some allegation, there's some indication that some agent of some player was informed by who alone knows that Pakistan players may not be preferred to be picked for teams that are owned by Indians in the 100. But there's absolutely no proof at this point of time. And of course, Dr. Ioannidis has explained in great detail how difficult it's going to be for anyone to prove that it was an objective statistical matter and why somebody is picked and not the other. Because after all, I'm not suggesting this is an entirely private league. The ECB is involved, but they're private owners. And I'm sure that in their remit, in their contract, they can pick who they wish to according to their own strategies. And if certain players don't fit into their strategies, it's very difficult for those players to convince somebody else or a court or arbitration that, no, we should have been picked, because it's entirely the prerogative of the owners of leagues, especially in league cricket. Perhaps in national team selection, there could be a few cases where a certain section feels left out. And in India, I know there have been several cases of selection, whether it's to the Olympics or Asian Games or whatever, where the selection committee or the federation is taken to court by a player saying, but I'm decidedly better and why didn't I make it? That's a very different proposition. But a team taken through an auction, I think the team owners have a complete prerogative on who they wish to take and who they don't. So we don't know how this is going to play out. And by the way, there are two teams which don't have Indian owners, so I suppose there could be a fair number of Pakistan players going to those teams.
4, I think.
Yeah. What? Yeah, 4. So I really think that also when it comes to there's no such indication yet, but a government-to-government kind of decision-making process, then I think teams franchise teams are well below what governments can possibly advise them to do or not. So I don't think this is particularly complicated. If the Indian-owned franchises decide not to take certain players, I don't think it's going to be a nationality thing. It's just a selection prerogative.
Well, Aaron, when it comes to Pakistan players, I mean, you're there in Australia, and the men's and women's Big Bash League has featured a number of Pakistan players in recent seasons. Just what kind of impact have they made, and what would teams in the 100 potentially miss out on if, and it is an if at this stage, some of them don't sign any Pakistan players?
Yeah, I think they've had an immeasurable impact, to be honest, Ali, and that's just not for what they can provide on field. We know the accolades that a lot of the Pakistani players have on the international stage. Even just from a marketing perspective, to get someone like Babar Azam in at the Sydney Sixers this year, you could see what they did for the crowd numbers, what they did in terms of their promotion and the excitement around their games. And then, Mohammad Rizwan as well, like someone who is such a well-known name across the cricket community, comes in, provides the Renegades a bit of a boost. We've got Pakistan's captain, Shaheen Shah Afridi, down here. So there's a lot of excitement in terms of what they provide. And the big names that have impacted, throughout the history of the tournament. So Haris Rauf is the leading wicket taker currently in the Big Bash, but you can go back to Yasir Arafat, Naveed Ul Hasan. So there have been numerous Pakistan players who have, been significant in terms of their on-field performance and off-field, what they've done from a marketing perspective as well. I'll preface that though by saying, if any of these allegations, end up happening, there is a justification in a sense as to why maybe some teams don't want to pick them. And that would be, I guess, if you look at the short term and what happened in the Big Bash this year, because of the instability, and we touched on this before, of the Pakistan Cricket Board, we had players who were removed early from the tournament who were pulled back to their national commitments. Shaheen Shah Afridi was someone who got injured, and he departed 4 games in. Babar Azam and Mohammad Rizwan, weren't the best in terms of their form, and then were returned back to their home country. So I guess there's always that concern from an international level, what might happen in terms of their objection certificates, and whether or not, Pakistan cricket decides that enough's enough and the players have to come home. And in that sense, when you're signing a Pakistani player right now, you need to be aware that their availability might not be for an entire tournament. And that's probably the only risk that you run when you sign someone, because ultimately all of these players have tremendous talent and have their own accolades individually, but what they can provide in terms of a franchise cricket tournament is tremendous. So that's probably the juggling act that a lot of the 100 teams will have to do. And maybe that is a reasoning why they decide not to pick a Pakistan player.
I feel it would have been interesting to have seen the nominations for this final auction list, because that wasn't made public. Only one nomination was needed from a team for a player to make that final auction list, i.e. for them to express interest. So it would have been interesting to see whether any of the teams with Indian ownership did express any interest in Pakistan players at this stage. But we just simply do not know that. But we'll certainly be keeping an eye on how the auction unfolds. Well, that is it for Stumped for this week. So I'll say thank you to Aaron Bryans and to Charu Sharma, and to all of you. Make sure you join us again next week when we will know which team has been crowned T20 World Cup champions. Bye for now.